Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Well, in a story that can best be filed under We Have No Allies, the white media is trying to make a little bit of hay out of the idea that the Cherokee Nation is seeking black descendants linked to slavery as it tries to atone. Man, talk about a few words that are doing some really heavy lifting there. The first problem with that statement, of course, is the whole slavery thing. While the Red Indians did have black people as slaves and fought to preserve the enslavement of black people, it's also true that there were a lot of black folks who were in those areas who were residents, who had never been slaves of anyone, certainly not the Red Indians. And even they admitted that, by the way. But putting aside the minimalization of black people in the history of the so-called Cherokee Nation, what is exactly that they're doing to atone? Well, obviously, they're going to be making sure that there's cash payments, right? Because that's exactly what the whole Cherokee Nation membership in their tribe is supposed to be about, material benefits. So that's what they're talking about, right? Because they've been definitely depriving black folks there of their benefits for the longest time. No, nothing about that. No tangibles at all. Instead, what the tribal officials are talking about, and tell me if this sounds familiar, they're talking about they want to seek stories, photographs, and memorabilia from families in Oklahoma and California as part of the project to develop a deeper meaning of the Freedmen experience. The goal is to eventually house an exhibit at the Cherokee National History Museum. That's their idea of atonement. Sounds just like what all these good white liberals always do, what the white media always does whenever it comes time to talk about punishing the thugs in blue. Oh, well, let's not talk about punishment. Instead, let's talk about taking them to the African American History Museum. They need some cultural sensitivity. So all of these tribes that have been practicing anti-black racism for the longest time, they don't need to be making cash payments to any black folks. Instead, what they need is some cultural sensitivity. You guys can make a couple of donations to an exhibit at the Cherokee National History Museum. Well, it just goes to show they haven't changed. Let me give you a little bit of backstory about the Cherokee Nation, though this also applies to those other Native American groups as well. First of all, these guys were not merely involved in the slave trade, they were neck deep in it. They did everything from slave owning to selling our ancestors and working as slave catchers. I'm sure that you probably heard about the Trail of Tears. We all heard about the Trail of Tears. The Native Americans were forced on this long, arduous journey as the ruthless United States government relocated them, and why they had not done any harm to anyone at all. Why the only thing they wanted to live was at peace with the land, because, as the white media keeps telling us, the Native Americans want harmony with nature and in their environment. They're all about balance and harmony. Well, apparently nobody told the Cherokee Nation chiefs about that or their membership. Because you had Cherokee slaveholders, including the chief of the Cherokee Nation himself, John Ross, who was also involved in the slave trade. See, that part gets left out when they talk about the Trail of Tears. That you had a number of Cherokee members, including the chief of the tribe, who was engaged in owning black people as slaves. They don't talk about that. And what they also don't talk about is that there were numerous African Americans who were on that Trail of Tears journey as well. They leave the black folks out when they tell the story. And it was not just numerous African American slaves. There were a large number of the group who were free themselves, by the way. But the thing is, they left the black folks out. They leave out the part about the slave owning. They leave out the part about, oh, there were black people who were out there with us. They leave all of that out. No, this is not the white media who did it. This happened to be the Cherokee themselves. And although I do occasionally, if not frequently, talk about the difference between the white Indians and the red ones, for the most part, I draw no distinction between them because they both draw from the same well and they were both operating out of the same playbook. Not because I said so, but because they said so. Now, if you studied anything about the 19th century, particularly the Old West and Manifest Destiny, you've certainly come across the phrase, the 5 so-called civilized tribes. Now, what that meant was these guys were the MVPs of collaborating with the European invaders, and they did everything that they could to be honorary members of the oppressor class. As Smithsonian Magazine's website puts it, the 5 civilized tribes were deeply committed to slavery, established their own racialized black codes, immediately reestablished slavery when they arrived in Indian Territory, rebuilt their nations with slave labor, crushed slave rebellions, and enthusiastically sided with the Confederacy in the Civil War. And this is who were called the civilized tribes, because there's nothing more civilized than slavery. These are the same people who want President Jackson removed from the money because he was so brutal towards them. I don't see why they're angry. He did the exact same thing that they were doing. Rebuilt their nations with slave labor. Yeah, the same way the U.S. government was doing that with black folks, the Cherokee Nation doing the same thing, and they weren't alone. Those others were in it with them. And they sided with the Confederacy in the Civil War. You don't have a moral leg to stand on talking about being mistreated when you side with Evil Incorporated. For all of those non-white groups who keep trying to claim, oh, we don't have anything to do with slavery, reparations, that has nothing to do with us. Why? We didn't have... Nah, especially when it comes to these Native American groups, they were neck deep in the slave trades. When we talk about reparations, yeah, that includes them too. And you'll have a lot of them online who'll get angry whenever you point out, hey, Claude Anderson was also one of the people who emphasized that the Native Americans were neck deep in the slave trade. Oh, why are you saying those things? Oh, that's terrible. Well, the reason people are saying it is because it's true. That's the historical record. Nobody made it up. This wasn't something that somebody invented. This is simply what happened. The real question is, why is it that you got people who are determined to try to hide it, to suppress it, to try to make sure that this is erased? But even after the Civil War, the anti-black racism from the Cherokee Nation did not subside. In 1866, the Cherokee Nation signed an agreement with the U.S. government promising that they would abolish slavery in their own domains. Now imagine that. Here these guys are talking about they want to be free from white oppression. Meanwhile, they're going, well, we want to be free, but we want to make sure that black folks are not. The same red Indians who were complaining about oppression under the white man gladly, gleefully, enthusiastically allied themselves with the Confederacy to hold black people in bondage. So they didn't give up slavery because they discovered religion. Apparently, nothing in Native American culture drove them to the idea that slavery was wrong. They only did it because the U.S. government compelled them to. And the 1866 treaty further declared that the freedmen, the black people who they had enslaved, were citizens of the tribe as well as all free colored persons who were in the country at the start of the Civil War. Now, this treaty that the Cherokee Nation had helped to write and agreed to, by the way, it declared that the freedmen were residents of the Cherokee Nation and that they had all the rights of tribal membership, such as running for office, etc., etc. But of course, the Red Indians never accepted the Cherokee, and that's why I consider the Black Cherokee, and even they agree with it later on, by the way. They never accepted the Cherokee in their midst, and it wasn't just because of the white $5 Indians either. This is an anti-black attitude that they had had all along. The Native American tribes practiced much of the same anti-black racial barriers and exclusion and even violence that black people faced outside of the reservations. You call yourself saying that there were black people who happen to be members of this or that tribe, or you have some black person represented as a member of these tribes, they would be the first ones to say, oh, this is wrong, this is exclusionary, how can you put this in there, this is revisionist, this is crazy. That's what they would be doing. They'd be the first ones doing that. Fast forward to 1992, the Cherokee Nation Council passed an act declaring that only those who were, quote, Cherokee by blood were members of the tribe, and that this blood could only be certified based on the, wait for it, the Dawes rolls. That's right. The same Dawes rolls that the white people paid $5 to get themselves artificially listed on was now being used by the Cherokee Nation as the litmus test for who was Cherokee by blood. You can't make this stuff up. And that's when the Cherokee Nation Council really began going in on the Cherokee, the black ones, after that, openly practicing their anti-black racism and hostility, formally declaring that black Cherokee didn't have the right to run for office, or anything else in their domains. Yeah, they went from surly to openly hostile real fast. Notice how they don't talk about this part. This led to a series of lawsuits, but the racists in the Cherokee Nation didn't back down. They doubled down, especially when the subject of federal money came up. They were so bold, so egregious, just so absolutely over the top with their anti-black vitriol. They wanted to make sure that everybody knew we can't stand these niggers around here. They videotaped themselves voting black people out of their tribes, expelling all black people. They were racially cleansing their little tribes. They wanted to make sure people saw them doing it. They were videoing themselves doing this mess. Here they are racially purging black people. They're practicing open ethnic cleansing, and apparently, as far as they're concerned, let everybody see it. They're trying to declare exactly where they stand, where the subject of black people are concerned. Now, they didn't have any problems with all of them white $5 Indians running around or anybody else, but black people, it's too much. Now, this is very important to note, because for about the last 25 or so years at least, you've had a lot of black people in this country who have been putting on the cape for red Indians, especially when it comes to sports teams. You've had black actors, black comedians, black commentators, all decrying how disrespectful it is to have a sports team called the Redskins, or this or that team with the tomahawk chop or whatever. And while these Negroes, who are desperately trying to prove to their white liberal buddies how progressive they are, while these Negroes were taking offense at how red Indians felt about a sports team's name, or a logo, or a particular gesture that crowds do at a sporting event, these same high-minded Negroes totally missed how those exact same red Indians were banding together and systematically expelling black people out of their own tribal nations. Oh yeah, racism against red Indians is bad, but when they practice it against black people, well, is it really wrong? And worse than that, you didn't have any of these Native Americans in any part of the society calling this stuff out. Do you think of any Native Americans, be they actors, politicians, writers, or whomever, who pointed out, wait a minute here, what about all this racially purging black people from the tribes and such? Isn't that wrong? Nah, they didn't seem to recognize the perverted irony there either. 2011, a U.S. District Court finally ruled that the Freedmen are members of the Cherokee and have all the rights that tribal citizens have, including the right to run for office, vote in elections, receive benefits, including access to tribal health care and housing. Now keep in mind, the Cherokee Nation went to court to try to stop that. It was a U.S. court that made them do it, that made it clear this is what it's got to be. So you see that whole 1866 thing wasn't some fluke. And the Cherokee Nation wasn't through fighting at that point. They were still going back to court going, well, we don't care what this white man's court says. We have declared that we are ethnically cleansing all these niggers, and that's all there is to it. Finally, in 2018, a U.S. District Court finally said, look, this is the end of it. These freedmen, they're part of the tribe. You're stuck with them whether you like it or not, and that's the end of it. Besides, you signed an agreement saying so. You got to honor your word. Or is your word worth nothing? That was 2018, folks, just 4 years ago. By the way, that's the same year that the white leader of the so-called Cherokee Nation, this guy who was called Principal Chief Bill John Baker, a far cry from Sitting Bull or Running Wolf, don't you think? But old Tribal Chief Baker, he was declaring that we're going to recognize MLK Day as a holiday here. Now think about that. These Native Americans, this Cherokee group, they didn't even recognize Dr. King Day as a holiday until just 4 years ago. I want you to think about that. That's how anti-black and racist these guys are. As far as they're concerned, we don't care about Dr. King. He's black. That has nothing to do with us. And this Baker clown, he tries to sprinkle sugar on crap by saying Dr. King fought for the rights of all people of color. And meanwhile, you had the Cherokee Nation fighting against the rights of black people. How ironic. How cynical. How perverted to say that. These racists tried everything they could to be part of the dominant society, and when that didn't pan out for them, they turned on the only people who had ever helped them and who had never done them wrong. And finally, February 22nd, 2021, that was less than a year ago, 10 years after a U.S. court first declared that the Freedmen are in fact Cherokee, as the Red Indians had agreed to, the Cherokee Supreme Court finally declared that the by blood reference should be removed from the Cherokee Nation Constitution. Talk about pulling up the rear. The so-called Attorney General of the so-called Cherokee Nation said that the Freedmen should now simply be called Cherokee Citizens. Now, I'm sure that in her mind, such as it is, that's supposed to be some great compliment, but it's not. After the way that these anti-black racists disgrace themselves, they can't claim to be products of another age. They can't claim that, we didn't know any better. No, they knew better. They knew exactly what they were doing. I mean, when you decide you're going to vote against a holiday for Dr. King, you're pretty much declaring that you are not a product of a bygone era. You're just a dyed-in-the-wool anti-black racist. Full stop. The same people who were happy that black Cherokee were being expelled, they're still around today. And at no point does anyone talk about money when it comes to the Freedmen. They never do that. Instead, it's the same old empty talk about inclusion and recognition and acceptance. This is not some redemption for them. It just goes to show that the 1866 treaty was not a fluke. These guys were going to hold anti-black racism in a death's grip, and were it not for the U.S. government, this meaningless ruling from an illegitimate gang of bigots would never have happened. The U.S. government decides what these guys get, so their opinion doesn't really matter, though it is instructive as to what their attitude towards black people is. Well, as far as I'm concerned, they can save the empty gestures for the white media's cameras. We only deal in substance here, and their actions have spoken far louder than their words. This is why these alliances are dead on arrival, family. You got these other groups who have had dozens, if not hundreds of years to ally themselves with us, and they never have. The problem isn't that they don't know. It's not that we haven't made a persuasive enough argument or we haven't used the right words. The problem is they're not buying what you're selling. They're holding out for a comfortable place under white supremacy, and they are fully willing to fight to enforce it. The same way that you see these dyed-in-the-wool racists like racist Tom DeSantis in Florida and Greg Abbott in Florida, they're trying to purge the historical record and erase the racism against black people. You got groups like the Cherokee Nation who just decide, well, we're not going to chronicle any of that stuff altogether. We're just going to leave that out. We're way ahead of the white supremacists on this one, or so they think. So I know that there's some black folks out there, especially black women, who whenever you mention about their ancestry, they'll always make sure to say, well, I've got some Native American, this, that, and a third. But you might want to ask yourself if those people who you're attempting to try to link yourself to, would they ever link themselves with you? A heck of a lot of those Red Indians, more than are willing to admit it, have black ancestry, and they know it. But what they also know is that the dominant society may not be aware of it, and they're holding out a candle for their idea that they're going to have a place under white supremacy, if they're able to finagle or finesse it. That's the schedule that they've got. That's the agenda that they're pursuing. If somebody gives you their word, and this person decides they're going to write it down and say, I give my word on this, this is who I am. And when that person immediately turns around and breaks their word and spends the next 150 years making it very clear we're going to do everything that we can to break our word and to slap the people in the face who helped us, that's not some misunderstanding. That is the reality. This is what the Cherokee Nation leadership and a dang majority of its membership have done to black people. And it wasn't a misunderstanding, it wasn't an oversight, it was deliberate. And I am not so naive as to pretend as if somehow this attitude has magically evaporated just because it's 2022. There's no way that giving a couple of artifacts and memorabilia to any museum is going to atone for that. The only thing that would atone for it is to make sure that you put money in these people's pockets. There's been real damage done to these black people by the Cherokee Nation and these other Native American groups. Real damages require real restitution. And that restitution isn't a handshake and a we accept you and we're going to drop the whole Freedmen thing. See how progressive-minded we are. Why, we don't even say Freedmen, we just say Cherokee. You can keep the phony honorifics. If you're serious about atoning, then what you need to do is you need to step up with the money that's owed. That's what's called for here. To do anything less than that would make someone, and you'll pardon the expression, an Indian giver. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Elbert Sanders, Ginger Vine, Lok Thies, Mandisa, and George Franklin. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.